Okay, so I'll be doing Isengard now, and I'll be doing them in a slightly different way. So I'll set up, and then we'll go through their mildly changed roster. Okay, so I have all the stats noted down, and we'll go through each unit in this way. I really don't know why I hadn't thought about doing this before, especially just in the updated versions of the faction, seeing as we've seen them in action all before. So, oh, there's my general. Oh, a little speech. Anyway, well, we'll start deployment. Now then. Isengard are a faction with which I can display all of their roster all in one go. It might be that I need to divide up some factions into their infantry, cav, archers, and siege as a result of some being so large. Right, hold on. There we go. Nice and thinly stretched out. Now, so we'll start at this end and go down. So we'll be starting at the low tier melee infantry and ending on the siege. So first of all, we have pretty much the worst melee unit in the game, it must be said. The Snaga Stalkers. They're pretty terrible. Just as terrible as in vanilla, really, because their stats haven't been buffed, whereas most other things have at least got a small buff. My general's in the Snaga unit, but you would never put your general in a Snaga unit otherwise. Well, you'd have to be mad to do that, really. Nonetheless, the stats on these guys, 2 attack, 5 defense, and 1 charge is pretty atrocious. They can't form any sort of formations. They're very cheap, of course, 290 florins. Like with most units in this submod, you can have 4 before the price increases. That's pretty universal. There aren't many units with which that is not the case. There is only one in all of Isengard, aside from the Siege, in which that is the case, but we'll get to them a little later on. The Snaga do have one bonus in that their combat effectiveness is increased slightly in woods, so perhaps as a sort of meat shield ambush type affair they can be effective, but other than that I would suggest they are pretty useless all around. Yeah, as a meat shield they might find some use, but in this submod in particular where there are so many other units for honestly not that much more florins, in multiplayer you would never really be using these. In single player, of course, early on you would probably be using them to pad out your army, but this is more of a multiplayer focused overview, so we'll be moving on to immediately one of the most effective units that Isengard can bring to bear. In vanilla, this was the case, and it is still the case because it is their pikes. Their pikes have gone down in price actually, so that's interesting, and that's really the only change that you can expect. In vanilla, their pikes were honestly pretty expensive, but they were still worth it because of how numerous they were and how effective they were. And this is still the case, only their price has gone down slightly. You can have 4 before the cost increases, and it starts at 575 florins as opposed to, I think it was 750 in vanilla. So they are now considerably better in terms of their value for money. They still have their decent armor, so while you won't want these guys getting shot with arrows, they will stand up to them better than some of the lightly armored pikes that you'll find, or lighter armored pikes. They are also a straight up pike unit as opposed to a halberd that you'll see in the other orc factions, so they have the very long spears, which I prefer because it means their effectiveness in formation is slightly increased. Out of formation they're pretty substantially worse, but if you're using pikes out of formation then something has gone drastically wrong. They have 4 attack, 9 defense, and 4 charge, so not terrible stats, but really the stats for pikes are kind of irrelevant because you're only going to be using them in formation unless you've been caught off guard. So yeah, the pikes, really not a lot of change here other than the cheaper price, which means they will be better now than they were before. Moving on to what used to be their highest tier unit, which, aside from the berserkers really, is the Guards of Orthanc. Now, they have not really changed at all. They still have the high cost at 750 florins. They cannot form shield wall, which is a bit of a letdown. I was hoping that with the addition of shield wall on some of the infantry units elsewhere that these guys would have been upgraded to form shield wall as well, but no, they can still only form Skiltron, which is a bit of a letdown. Nonetheless, they have been buffed slightly in terms of defense. 21 defense is pretty darn substantial. They are of course still spears as well, so you won't really want to be charging your cav into these guys if you can help it, because they'll lose in a prolonged melee fight pretty easily to the guards of Orthanc. They will not go down easily. In terms of defense, they are still Isengard's best unit, although overall I would say they are now outclassed by a few other units in their roster. They are the only unit as well to have the very well armoured stat in the Isengard roster, so they will stand up pretty well to missiles as well. Overall, still a very nice unit, although I would say that their necessity in your army has been lessened a bit by the addition of one unit in particular. Nonetheless, in a siege, defensive siege in particular, these guys can still find their use, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, their stats on the attack and on the charge are pretty low, as you'd expect from a spear, but they are really designed to be a nice survivable block in a choke point to sort of stay alive as long as possible, and they will fulfill that role very, very nicely. You can put your general in them if you like, but that's a job which I feel has been taken by another unit, potentially anyway. Moving on to what used to be their most effective unit. They've been given a new sound file as well with that snarling, and that's the Berserkers. Now, interestingly enough, the Berserkers are one of the few units in this submod which I believe have been given a nerf. Before, it was a case of they were basically Trolls Light, or Diet Trolls, because they were so hard to kill, they did so much damage. The only thing they really had against them that the Trolls had was their mass, enabled to sort of smash through lines. Now, though, they have taken a nerf in the sense that they are now less survivable, considerably less survivable, in the sense that they are now bad versus missiles. Their defense score is only 5, which is woeful in this submod. It's as bad as the Snaga Stalkers. And they only have 2 hit points. Now, the hit points still mean that they will be they'll be much more survivable than the Snaga Stalkers, because, they can take more hits, but they will no longer tank out a great deal of damage, which is what they could do in vanilla. So you can't really use these guys as a crutch anymore as Isengard. They were pretty easily Isengard's best vanilla unit. Now I would say maybe not so much. They are shock infantry, however, and their attack is 11, and their charge is 6. So that's good stats for a shock infantry, although most shock infantry has got decent defense now. These guys do not. Having said that, they are good against cav and armor like most shock infantry is. They are cheap now though, only 480 per unit, and you can have 4 before the price increases. They have also got more men per unit, although it's only about 30 men more, so I would say the nerf hasn't really been worth it in that respect. They still cause fear though, which is something that most shock infantry does not do. As far as using them, I would say that they are most useful when trying to take walls in an offensive siege. So, in a similar way to the movie, in taking Helm's Deep's outer wall, this is really what these guys are built for now. In a field battle, they are pretty vulnerable to archers of all descriptions. Getting charged by cav is also a bit of a concern, because their bonus versus cav doesn't really kick in until the sustained melee sets in. So, really these are the shock infantry, which is honestly most like vanilla, because they will die pretty quickly unless you use them correctly. So, yeah, unfortunately a bit of a nerf, but they are still useful provided you use them correctly. They can be useful in a field battle if you charge them into an area of the enemy line which you perceive is sort of breaking. These guys will probably cause them to break because of their fear and because of their high initial damage, but in a sustained melee they will start to drop, and against arrows and against cav charges they will take significant damage, so use with caution. Next up we have uruk-hai raiders. They were a unit which honestly weren't very useful in vanilla because they were significantly worse than all the units that were above them. They have, however, been given a significant buff in the sense that their defense is now pretty high. It's 13, which means as a basic infantry unit you may very well want to use them. They cost 520 each, which is kind of a lot. They don't have any special abilities either. They're not particularly well armoured, so they can be picked apart by archers. If you wanted to save money, however, on your mainline infantry, it may not be a bad idea to get them, although you won't be saving an awful lot, so I would still say that they suffer a bit from being defunct in online play, because it's very easy to afford some of the slightly better units with the amount of money that they cost. So If you wanted to sort of pad out your army a little bit, it might be worth getting these guys. It's certainly worth getting them over the Snaga Stalkers, so keep that in mind. Yeah, not really anything special about them, but they don't do a great deal wrong either. Just a basic sword and shield unit. Moving on to the other shock infantry that Isengard bring to bear, that's the uruk-hais. I always were a big fan of how these guys looked in vanilla, sort of basic leather and then these very nasty looking two-handed axes. They are of course shock infantry, and they are essentially shock infantry which, if you didn't want to use the berserkers, these would be your next port of call, because they are slightly better defense, but slightly worse attack and charge. They're good versus cav and armor, just like the berserkers, although they're pretty bad against missiles as well. They're not particularly heavily armored. Really what you're getting with these guys that you're not getting with the berserkers is the 100 more men, which in a field battle I would say is potentially more useful, because the berserkers are pretty easily singled out, whereas these guys maybe not so much. As I said, their stats, basically a little bit more defense, but they're not as survivable as the berserkers, because the berserkers have 2 more hit points, but there are less of them, so it kind of balances itself out. The berserkers, however, have fear, which I think does tip them over the uruk-hai in terms of effectiveness. The uruk-hai are also more expensive now, 560 per unit. Of course, the standard 4 before the price increases. Yeah, pretty much your basic shock infantry. They're not as survivable as some of the Kingdoms of Men or Dwarven shock infantry, but there are much more of these guys. With the Kingdoms of Men, you're looking at 150, maybe even 120. These guys, 202. So, yeah, pretty much your standard quantity over quality shock infantry here. Next we have the main line of your army, the uruk-hai infantry. They've been given a buff, pretty substantial buff as well, because they have 18 defense now. That's honestly not that much less than the Guards of Orthanc, and they have more attack obviously at 6. They are well armoured as well, naturally. Like most of the sort of heavily armoured uruk-hai units, they will perform pretty well under arrow fire. You don't really want them getting hit with arrows as always, but it's not the end of the world if they are. It's what really puts them over most other orc infantry, is the fact that they have very nice armour. They do cost 575 each, which is less than vanilla. It's kind of a similar story with the uruk-hai pikemen. They've become much more affordable whilst becoming more effective, which I do like. I do like a lot. Other than that, there's not really a great deal of change here. Nice buff for them though. And then we have the uruk-hai bodyguards, which are essentially individually a buffed version of the infantry. They have well, not much better stats. They have 1 more attack at 7, 2 more defense at 20, and 1 more charge at 4. So it's, having 100 less in the unit, is it worth it? I don't know. This general's bodyguard is pretty decent though. So, I don't know. It's basically just a much better version of this. They do cost 800 each, so it is a substantial amount more. This is essentially what you were looking at in vanilla in terms of uruk-hai infantry, in terms of cost anyway. Maybe it's worth having 1 just to house your general. Other than that, get uruk-hai infantry. Moving on to the skirmisher contingent Isengard have, and this is where really the first of the substantial changes kicks in, because the substantial Isengard changes have happened at range. Now, first of all, you have the Snaga archers, which is not where the substantial changes happen. They had these, and these guys are just as useless as ever, terrible in melee. 180 florins each means they are the cheapest unit Isengard can field. They have the combat bonus in woods, which most Snaga have, but again, archers in woods, not really the best idea, because you blunt their effectiveness, essentially. Their missile score is also 1, which is absolutely atrocious. I would say that you will never be using these in an online battle. Single player, maybe, early on. Online multiplayer, never. They have had their effectiveness essentially stripped away entirely. The next unit is the most substantial change to Isengard, and that is the Uruk bomb throwers. Again, if any of you have played Medieval 2, which I'm sure you have, you'll remember the Nafatoons, and these guys are essentially a reskinned Nafatoon unit, which means they are devastating in choke point battles. Their range is terrible. They don't have a lot of ammunition either, but if you can get them to throw their bombs into a choke point, you will annihilate an enemy defense, which is, when you use them in conjunction with your pikemen, this makes Isengard a very, very scary faction to face when they're the attackers in a siege. when they're the defenders in a siege too, honestly, because you can set these guys up in a good area, throw the bombs into a choke point, and you'll repulse the enemy pretty quickly, honestly. And they're not bad in melee, honestly. They have 18 defense, and they're well armored as well, which, you know, you wouldn't think so to look at them, because they just look like uruk-reivers, but instead of their big axes, they've got bombs and an uruk-hai machete on their back. Nonetheless, as Isengard now, I would suggest, certainly in a siege, you always bring these guys. While they are not terrible at holding up under archer fire, archers are still their main weakness on a field battle, however, and cavalry, of course. Because if you're facing off against Isengard and you see bomb throwers in the enemy army on a field battle, you're going to want to single these guys out. Kind of like the new berserkers of Isengard. They're a very, very scary unit. And if they get to do their work, Isengard may very well win the match because of how much damage they can do. Similar to the full Rim of Rune. Moving on to the Snaga Skirmishers, a javelin unit. Javelins have been buffed across the board, but unfortunately Snaga Skirmishers haven't really benefited from... Oh, these are actually the cheapest unit at 150. These guys haven't really benefited from the increased damage that javelins can do, however. Only 6 missile damage, sadly. They do have a combat bonus in woods, and with javelins, that's a bit less of a problem than it is with archers. It's still not brilliant, though. 252 men throwing their javelins is, you know, you're going to deal a significant amount of damage if you can get into range, but generally speaking, these guys are going to be picked apart in a field battle. Maybe in a siege, you could justify using these guys, but I doubt it because you'll be using the bomb throwers primarily, and to back them up, you will be using the crossbows, one of my favourite Isengard units in vanilla. Still the case because crossbow's missile score has been buffed, their missile score is 11. They can now also deploy stakes, which means in a field battle, they may very well be more useful. One of the crossbow's biggest problems in a field battle, of course, is that they can be outranged by archers, but significant damage will be coming from these guys. They're pretty decent in melee. Really, the only score you need to worry about in melee with these guys is defense at 12, which is very, very good. They're well armored, of course, just like all the uruk-hai units. Other than that, though, the crossbows are pretty much going to function the same as they used to in vanilla. Next, we have really the only long-range missile unit that Isengard can bring to bear that's anywhere near useful, and that's the uruk-hai archers. Although I would still say these guys are not particularly fantastic. Their missile score is only 4. They can deploy stakes as well, which is always nice to have a bit of utility in your archers. They cost 575, just the same as the crossbows essentially, and what you're getting for that is the range. Perhaps in a field battle you'll want some of these just so that you can get some arrows down range at a greater range than your crossbows. Their stats in melee are significantly less than the crossbows because their defense is much lower. As you can tell, they don't really have armor. It's the same story as the uruk-hai raiders. Nonetheless, this is really your only option for long-range battle that is resembling some sort of effectiveness. So you may want to bring these in a field battle, although in a siege I would suggest crossbows and bomb throwers all the way. And your only cav is still the warg riders. The warg riders do have a bit of a change to them though. 720 is still pretty expensive, but honestly, with how cheap the rest of your army is, they become a little bit more viable nowadays. 9, 5, and 9 are their stats, so defensively they're still woeful. They're going to get picked apart by archers, particularly crossbows. But in sustained melee as well, that defense score is going to mean they're going to drop significantly. 9 charge is not bad though. It means they will function as a sort of cav unit, as long as you get the charges off, as long as you've got good micro. The one thing that these guys might very well be good at, though, is warding off enemy cav, because they do have a bonus versus cav, which means if you can trap enemy cav in melee with the warg riders, you're going to trade efficiently with them, because while you may not win in sustained melee against something like Knights of Innuminus, you're still going to do damage to them because of that bonus versus cav, which means you're going to be getting your value for money out of these guys, because one, the enemy cav is tied up, which means a significant weakness of Isengard is kind of dealt with there and then. And the warg riders are also going to be doing a fair amount of damage to them, which is nice. Although I will say, like, this is going to be the most expensive part of your mainline army, except from the guards of Orthanc and your uruk-hai bodyguards, so that's worth bearing in mind. Of course, you have access to a ballista, you have access to a catapult, more effective than vanilla. You also, however, have access to this, which is a new siege. the fire launcher. Looks like a Korean Hwacha, I think is the name of it. Anyway, the fire launcher is essentially a wildly inaccurate but potentially devastating siege unit. It's not got a great deal of range. Picture it really as a ballista that is wildly inaccurate but potentially more damaging, is how I would picture it. It's not, you wouldn't want to use these guys against a wall, for example. That's a job much better left to a catapult. There's only 13 of them as well, so they're very vulnerable to getting cav charged. So I think in order to sort of make up for that, they have allowed this unit to deploy stakes. They can't just be charged from the front. Nonetheless, this is an interesting unit indeed, and it gives Isengard another option in a field battle, I would say. Its inaccuracy is not really what you want in a siege battle, either offensively or defensively. That's something you're really going to want to use the catapult for. But in a field battle, as a sort of alternative to the ballista, this may very well be exceptionally damaging. Kind of similar to how the bomb throwers are at close range. While this is inaccurate, this could cause a great deal of damage at range if you get lucky, essentially. It's kind of pot luck. Potentially it could be pretty useless, but potentially you could rout 3 or 4 units with this thing pretty much instantly once it starts firing, if it's close enough. So yeah, that's Isengard. Not really a great deal of changes, aside from the sort of mechanical changes that the submod has delivered. Really, the bomb throwers are the most significant addition, I would say, and the fire launcher is another pretty significant addition. Other than that, the nerf to the berserkers is another pretty significant addition as well, or, you know, subtraction, that could even be called. Nonetheless, that is Isengard. I think they have actually been improved by the submod, despite the berserker nerf, because the bomb throwers are such a scary unit in a siege. They really are. And also the ability to deploy wargs now is nice, and their infantry just being a little bit more well armoured means they can go toe to toe with some of the more elite factions and potentially outlast them, which is nice. So yeah, that is the new and I think improved Isengard. Next, I think we'll move on to another Kingdom of Men, I think. Might do Dale. We'll see. We'll see.